Welcome everyone to Tech Canada's Deeper Insights webinar series. My name is Ruth Ann and I will be your host for today. As always, it is my pleasure to welcome everyone, and to all of our friends and neighbors, family and relatives in the United States, a happy Thanksgiving to everyone. Today, my guest is going to be Jabir Nathu, and Jabir is from BDC Advisory Services. We have invited Jabir today to talk a little bit about the breadth of what BDC offers to the business community. And just a little bit about Jabir is that he is a client partner and a business growth advisor for BDC. He has been quite impactful and helping businesses scale up and supporting them. He has, within his practice there, he has also done significant amount in business development as a strategic advisor for some of Canada's highest potential companies. He, prior to BDC, and this is important too, is that he was a part of the senior leadership team at a European mid-market healthcare services provider. So he has a bit of a, I would say, a global perspective as he brings this. And I also look at his education. So some of his education was done at the London School of Economics, and he finished off with he was at Simon Fraser as well. So you've spanned the country, Jabir, and so you know us well. Welcome.
Indeed. Ruth Ann, thank you very much for that kind introduction. First and foremost, just want to express my gratitude to you and the Tech Canada team for inviting me to join you and join your members on this morning's call. For us at BDC, it's always a privilege when we're able to work with other partners and speak with the members of other partners in our ecosystem, especially those that have such alignment over what our values and what our mission is. So at BDC, as a Crown corporation, we are focused through whatever business line we have, and I'll talk a little bit about the different business lines and the support that BDC has for Canadian businesses, but our objective really is to help entrepreneurs, Canadian businesses, to grow and scale. So when we can work with Tech Canada, who your mission is so centrally focused around the personal and professional development of your members and their companies, we're just really proud to be with you and really kind of commend you and your team for all the wonderful work that you're doing with Canadian businesses.
I thank you for that. And I want to encourage everyone during this presentation to please put your comments and questions into the question box. Jabir has made some time in the midst of the program to help answer and clarify anything that he's going to go through. And we will be recording this, and so it will be available on the Tech Canada website to be reviewed or shared with others. So without further ado, we'll let you carry on.
Thank you very much. So for the next kind of 45 minutes or so, we really want to jump into kind of a few topics. First, I'll do a quick introduction to add a little bit more perspective to what Ruth Ann has shared. And at the same time, I'll be talking a little bit about who BDC is and what BDC's role in the Canadian business landscape is, and what we really look to try to achieve and how we achieve that. I'll also share some insights from our research team about the impact of the pandemic on SMEs in Canada and how the last 8-9 months have changed the way that we do business, what we're seeing in the market, but also kind of outline what trends do we see kind of continuing past the end of the pandemic as we move into what is over and over in very much a cliched fashion, almost called a new normal. And then what I want to leave you all with is some kind of practical tips, a few topics of conversation that you can take away from this webinar and start having these conversations with your leadership teams within your own organizations to really help you kind of better equip yourselves for what is going to come and what changes are still on the horizon in our business in our business world. And lastly, even though I've put kind of Q&A here at the last, I really want this to be an interactive session. I would rather not be talking for half an hour straight. What I would love is, as you have kind of questions or comments as I'm going through this presentation, please put them in the chat box. And I have given Ruth Ann every permission in the world to interrupt me or to stop me and just highlight some of the key questions that are coming across. I've got the chat box on the screen in front of me as well, so I'll be keeping an eye on it, and I'll be trying to catch as much as I can as we go through this as well. So I'll start very much an introduction to myself. And while I introduce myself, I'd really welcome you to introduce yourselves on the chat. I would love to get a sense for everyone who's in this room. Moreover, I think it'd be great for everyone in the room to know who else is there. One of the most valuable things that these forums allow for us is for us to make connections. So I would really welcome you to say, who you are or what company you're from, very in one sentence what your company does and whereabouts in Canada or the world you may be located. And as I see those comments come in through the chat screen, I will be talking through a number of examples of not only BDC clients, but also other companies that we're aware of in the ecosystem. And I'll try to tailor the examples that I share to really be able to resonate with everyone who's in this virtual room. So as Ruth Ann shared, I'm a client partner at BDC Advisory Services. So I'm going to qualify this first, is that I'm one of the few people at BDC, or roughly about 350 people at BDC who can't give anyone any money whatsoever. And so that's that's kind of what my opening line is. And then quite often people say, well, hold on, well, what are you doing here and what are you doing at the BDC? The BDC has 3 business lines within it that are all tailored or geared to supporting Canadian businesses and Canadian entrepreneurs. We've got the side of BDC or the business line of BDC that most Canadian businesses are aware of, and that's BDC financing. And this is the bank part of BDC. This bank part of BDC is a bank exclusively for entrepreneurs. We don't focus on any other kind of segments. There's no retail kind of banking component to what BDC does. And even within this banking component, even within BDC financing, it is really focused around term debt, around real estate financing, working capital financing, equipment financing, in a really kind of flexible and patient manner to be able to support Canadian businesses. So back in March and April time, BDC, and still today actually, BDC was incredibly active in supporting Canadian businesses that were impacted by the pandemic and by COVID-19, just to do what we can to make sure that they have access to the capital that they need for their businesses to continue to survive and ultimately to be able to thrive, to be able to grow kind of past the pandemic into the next stage of their business journey. The next part of BDC, and it's one that less people know about, is BDC Capital. BDC Capital has 3 groups within it. The first group is what we call our growth and transitional capital team. This particular team really kind of focuses on slightly more complex financing products such as subordinated debt and mezzanine financing, all the way up to some quasi-equity solutions. And really tailored to helping support Canadian businesses with access to growth capital. We also within this group have what we call our growth equity team, and this is a group within BDC that directly invests in Canadian businesses and takes a minority stake and kind of deploys capital in that fashion. And we also have our venture capital teams within BDC Capital. And then the last business line of BDC is really where I reside, where my home is, and this is BDC Advisory Services. I quite often refer to this as one of the best kept secrets in the kind of Canadian business landscape. BDC Advisory Services is an in-house management consulting firm that BDC has. We've got roughly 300 people from coast to coast. Subject matter experts in everything from sales and marketing and growing top line revenue down to operational efficiency, to technology, to business strategy, organizational design, leadership, financial management. The list really goes on. We've got subject matter expertise in pretty much most of the domains that small and mid-sized businesses would need to grow their businesses. And my role as a client partner is really to make sure that our, BDC's clients or our clients and the companies that we engage with have access to the right expertise at the right part in their growth journey. And what the experience that I bring to this role very much is my experience prior to BDC. So I was not at all a career consultant. In fact, I've been a management consultant for the last 4 years. In the 15, 20 years before then, I spent most of my time in your shoes, either as an entrepreneur or as a leader within an incredibly entrepreneurial organization. The company that I spent most of my time with, I was responsible for building and executing the growth strategy, and we ultimately grew from 60 people to 600. So we've been through an incredible journey, and I'm very blessed to have been on that journey. And really, it's the lessons from that journey that I bring, and colleagues like me bring to our clients at BDC Advisory Services. So I've talked a little bit about who BDC is, with our three kind of business lines. The one group that I haven't talked about that I do want to share, and I think it's really important or pertinent to today's conversation, is our research and development group. Under the leadership of our chief economist, Pierre Cleroux, BDC has a phenomenal team of economists and researchers whose role really is to scan all the data about what's happening in the economy, not only in Canada, but in the economies of our largest trading partners. Also to scan what's happening with small and mid-sized Canadian businesses, and really to feed those insights back within the three business lines of BDC. So it's their insights that really form the lending strategy of BDC Financing, that form the investment strategy of BDC Capital, that forms the subject matter experts that BDC Advisory Services recruits to its teams, to really move forward. And what I want to do over the next 5 minutes is really to share some insights that Pierre and his team have pulled together about what's happening in the economy and with Canadian businesses at this particular moment. So the first thing that that we're seeing is that from kind of February, March onwards, there's been a pretty significant shock to the Canadian business landscape and to Canadian businesses, and that's not new news to any of us. We've heard this a few times over, but I just want to quantify this with some data, and this data really is coming from regular surveys that our team kind of moves forward with hundreds and hundreds of SMEs from coast to coast. So the first thing to really take note of is over the last 7-8 months, more than 3/4 of Canadian SMEs are reporting a decrease in sales and a decrease in profits and profitability. So this on its own is compelling, more than 3/4 of Canadian companies to look at changing the way they're doing things just to make sure that they survive, right? The second, a set of statistics that's really worth highlighting is that almost half of Canadian businesses have had to reduce staff over this period, and almost 40% of Canadian businesses have had to take on more debt or increase their exposure, just to ensure that they're able to have a continuity of operations as they adjust to the changing business landscape. But it's not all doom and gloom. There was an initial shock, but we are seeing a rebound. And this is data that we'd kind of compiled in August of this year, and we'll be constantly refreshing this data on a regular basis. But what we have seen is the economy recovering from that initial shock. As of July, August time, our GDP was 94% of what it was at the beginning of the year. But that initial, quick rebound that we saw, that rebound is tapering off. It's not plateauing, but it is tapering off. And the reason that it's tapering off and it continues to taper is because of anxiety around the impact that the second wave is of COVID is going to have on Canadian businesses. And so what will the next 3, 4, 5 months look like? There's still a level of uncertainty and anxiety around that. And that will continue until we can, firmly say we're on the backside of this pandemic, that there's a vaccine that has been, that we've been able to distribute, and that businesses are coming back to a more normal course of operations. The other thing to note, and another strong indicator that we at BDC look at on a regular basis, is just the employment statistics in Canada, because the employment statistics impact ultimately consumer behavior at the grassroots. So in kind of March, April, May time, we saw 3 million jobs be removed or lost from the Canadian economy. We've gained 2 million of those jobs back, but there's still 1 million that we have yet to gain back. And over the course of time, we're definitely eating into this number. Not all industries, as we know, and not all sectors have been impacted the same. Some sectors and some businesses we're seeing be much more successful and grow much more rapidly through COVID. And other sectors, such as hospitality, such as tourism, such as some elements of the retail sector, we're seeing having to play a bit of catch up and still feeling some pretty significant impacts from the changes around us. But the consumer behaviors that we're seeing change are really around consumers spending less, number one. But where they are spending less, we are also seeing very significant trends that they're spending more online. So the gross sales online in Canada is increasing. A trend that we're seeing in Canada and many other parts of the world are that people are willing to pay more for local products and for locally sourced goods. And there's two reasons for this. One is obviously this drive to support local, but the other one that I'll talk into much more detail as we go on through this presentation is just around how supply chains have been impacted in COVID, and local supply chains, regional supply chains are definitely being seen as much more resilient and robust. And then the last point that I'll talk about here is that, the undercurrent through all of this is that health concerns still remain at the forefront of most Canadians and many Canadian businesses. And so all of this together, when we look at all this data and when we look at all these trends, what does this mean for Canadian businesses? How does this translate into the strategy that Canadian businesses should be employing as they're looking to stay resilient and to be agile and to come out of the pandemic, ideally in a stronger position as a stronger organization than the one that they were when they went into the pandemic? So what I'll start with is really at a very high level, talking about what the crisis management phases look like for a typical company, and whether you follow a formal framework or whether you just did what felt natural to you and what felt right for your clients, your customers, for your organization, for your teams, for your employees. These 5 steps are typically what the buckets of activities that you undertook. So at the very beginning, March, April time, it was just initial crisis management. It was looking at the shock that was created to your kind of business landscape, to your business in particular, evaluating that shock and making sure that you responded to the shock in such a way that you safeguarded your clients and you safeguarded your employees. So in this shock, we had many clients or many companies in Canada that lost a significant part of their order book, that lost a significant part of their pipeline, that had orders canceled or postponed or delayed. This impacted their cash flow. And so part of the initial reaction for these organizations was to make sure that they were able to sufficiently capitalize themselves and make sure they had sufficient cash flow on hand to meet their obligations to their employees, to their vendors, and to be able to keep business running forward. Other examples of shock would have been in the retail sector, where all of a sudden we needed to make adaptations to storefronts and to working environments to make sure that they were safe for customers and clients and staff to be able to come into, changes on the production and manufacturing shop floors to make sure that they were safe for the people working there. And so all of these types of things were part of our initial crisis management. Once Canadian business leaders were over this initial crisis management or felt that they had been able to manage it as best as they could in that particular time, we went to kind of a period of resiliency planning. So what types of things can we be putting in place to make sure that we're going to be resilient, our business is going to be resilient as we move forward? So the types of activities that we see in this particular phase are the activities along the lines of the investment in technology tools that will allow more effective virtual work. So it might be investing in tools like Microsoft Teams or Zoom, tools like Slack, kind of communication collaboration tools that will allow companies to have their teams work virtually. As we went from that resiliency place to where we knew that, okay, we were starting to put the foundations in place to allow our organizations to really be sustainable if this was to be protracted and go on for 6 months, 12 months, possibly even longer. That's when Canadian businesses started moving into the last 3 phases. And where Canadian businesses are, for the most part, are somewhere within this grade area, where they're building recovery plans, that they're adapting their businesses, pivoting their business models where necessary, and really moving forward on the execution. And this is where I want to hone in on for the next, I would say, 20 odd minutes, are what types of things or what types of conversations can you be having and should you be having to best position yourself to actually go through these 3 stages. As you have those conversations with your leadership teams, one of the things that I would ask you to be mindful of are what trends will define this new normal. What trends are we going to see continuing throughout this pandemic, and what changes in business behavior are we likely to see to extend past the pandemic? One thing is for certain, we have now been in this working environment, in this working culture now for 7 months, 8 months. The working habits of individuals is changing, and there's parts of these habits that are likely to continue to some extent as we kind of emerge from the pandemic. And the behavior of consumers, of buyers, of customers is also evolving and changing as a result of just having been within this working environment for the amount of time that we have been. So the first thing that to acknowledge is that COVID and the impact of COVID isn't like a light switch, right? We did have that light turned off in March. It's not as simple as turning the light back on. The recovery will be slow and it will be gradual. So it's going to happen in increments as we manage the crisis and move beyond it. Social distancing and health habits will remain to some degree. Forums like this one where we virtually connect will be more and more prevalent even after we finish COVID. That whole concept of having meetings virtually rather than traveling to a site will also become more normal. There obviously will be face-to-face interaction, and that will return, and there's an incredible amount of value in that face-to-face interaction, but virtual activities will continue to some degree and be preferred by a number of the people that you do business with. Leading on from that, there's going to be a digitization of all businesses to some degree. Not fully digital, but just this digital evolution. COVID has been a catalyst to it and has really sped up digital evolution in our working generation. Secondly, or number 4, and I'm going to go into more detail on this, is just around what impact that COVID is going to have on our supply chains, not only in the short term, but also in the long term. And lastly, it's important to acknowledge kind of 2 things that's going to lead to an increased wave of acquisitions and consolidations in the market. Firstly, there's a significant number of companies that are not as strong now and will not be as strong in 3 or 4 months than what they were when they went into COVID. And they may feel that being acquired is the right step for the organization and for the entrepreneur. And at the same time, we've been hearing a lot about just the number of entrepreneurs and business leaders who fall into the boomer generation. And there's been a lot documented on how we're expecting to see a wave of businesses being sold over the course of the next 7 to 10 years. And what's happened with COVID is that COVID has put a pause on the exit plans of a number of those entrepreneurs. But as we come out of COVID, as those businesses' profitability and valuation returns to what the entrepreneur may feel more comfortable with in exiting, we're going to see an increase in those exits and in those acquisition activities. Now, as I kind of start going into what parts of your strategic plan or what types of things you should be talking about at a leadership level, as kind of a growth advisor to Canadian businesses, it would be, I would say, almost blasphemous for me not to talk about it under the context of a strategic plan. So one thing I'd love for you to put in the chat box so I can see is the answer to two questions. So the answer to the first question, a comma, and then an answer to the second question. The first question is the one that's on the screen in front of you. It's, has your company ever done a strategic plan? Is there a strategic plan that's a living, breathing document within your organization that you use to align your team and to communicate the course of direction that the organization is moving on? And number two is, have you updated that strategic plan post March, April 2020? Have you revisited that strategic plan? Have you recommunicated to your team what's the new direction, or what's the evolved or pivoted direction that the organization is moving in? The one thing that I'll point out is just how valuable strategic planning is as a tool, and I really want to quickly differentiate strategic planning from business planning. Business planning very much or a business plan is a document that that many organizations use to communicate what they are going to be doing, what growth targets they may have. A strategic plan really takes it a few steps past then. A strategic plan also communicates why you're doing it. So it kind of ties in what you're going to do with why you as an organization exist, what your vision is, what your mission is, and how that plan ties into who you as an organization are. And it talks about why you're going to be doing that. So what's happening in the external market that's influencing your decision, and on top of that, what is happening, or what strengths do you have as an organization internally that allow you to capture the opportunities that you're seeing in the wider marketplace? And then arguably, in my opinion, one of the most important parts of the strategic plan, if not the most important part of the strategic plan, is the action plan. So how are you going to achieve it? What initiatives, what steps are you going to take as an organization? And then who within the organization is going to be responsible and accountable for these activities, and how are you going to measure success? And the reason I wanted to outline this at the beginning of the conversation, or earlier on in our conversation, is as you have these conversations with your leadership team around your strategic direction, also think about the communication structures and the allocation of accountability, just to make sure that everyone within the organization is aligned and understands the why, and is able to move forward together in the right direction. So I'm going to talk about three things in, I would say, the next 15 minutes. And it's really three areas of your strategic plan to review. And these are coming from conversations that we at BDC have been having with Canadian businesses, and just levers that they've been able to pull that's having the most impact on their businesses. So the first is just looking at customer needs and positioning. The second is looking at the impact on distribution channels. And lastly, the impact on supply chain and operations, and just some of the considerations that you should be looking at as you evaluate these three things in the context of your business. In the startup space, when companies are really young, there's a lot of focus being placed on on something that venture capitalists and investors and startup leaders quantify as or qualify as product market fit. And this is really a concept that talks about how well a product can be commercialized in a particular market. Does it solve a market problem? Does it solve a market need? And are people willing to pay for it? Where most of us on this call are in our businesses, we've passed that product market fit. For us, we've got a product or a service offering that's proven itself in the market. We have clients, we have customers, we have profitability, or we had profitability at least before COVID happened. So we knew that there was a market for what we were doing. The conversation in our businesses really kind of moves from that product market fit to who our customers are, what our customers' needs are, and how well those customer needs tie into our value proposition, right? The impact that COVID has is it's changed that customer segment, customer need connection with the value proposition. Customer needs have evolved. They have changed. There have been many of our clients that have been impacted by COVID, and something that's become really important to them has been extended payment terms. There have been other clients that we've seen who all of a sudden their needs have been around having dependency on kind of other vendors that they work with, that it's no longer the cheapest cost option or a certain quality mark. All of a sudden, that entire kind of customer service component, that dependency on vendors has changed. And so one of the things that I would encourage you to talk about with your leadership team is just looking at your customer segments and evaluating how their needs have changed. And if you need to put a different level of attention to one segment over another. An example that I'll give is there's a company that we're aware of that's in the aircraft maintenance space. And they've got they've had three kind of main customer segments. The first is kind of the commercial airlines, so the Air Canadas, the WestJets, the Deltas of the world. The second segment is defense contracts and working with the Canadian Air Force. The third customer segment is kind of private carriers, kind of executive jets, so to speak, so for private travel. When COVID happened, the needs of those three customer segments all evolved. On the commercial airline segment, all of a sudden they saw a complete drop in demand. Planes were grounded. There weren't nearly as many planes flying, so there wasn't as many hours in the air, and that meant that the maintenance schedules for those aircrafts changed. So they had a loss in revenue from that one customer segment. Private air travel, that particular segment increased in traction. So there was many more people and executives and businesses electing to fly private in the early days of the pandemic. And then lastly, what they saw is that defense contract stay relatively the same. And what they were able to do when they looked at the changing needs of their three main customer segments is they were able to focus their attention on their growth opportunities within those customer segments while still maintaining the business relationships they had with other segments that had temporarily declined their demand. The other thing that they were able to do is look at what changing needs different customer segments had. So with commercial planes that were grounded, there was an opportunity working with some of their clients to do more preventative maintenance so that when the airlines did pick up again, that there was an opportunity for those planes to be in the air longer before they had to come in for their next maintenance activity. So just by looking at what the changing needs in their segments were, they were able to recover a significant portion of the revenue that they would have otherwise lost had they not paid attention to it. And it's similarly looking at your value proposition and how that's evolved, and looking at the changing needs of your customers, just to make sure that you have the right value proposition within your organization, that you have the right capabilities within your organization, and you're able to communicate that really effectively. So I'm just going to talk about some tools that we have on the BDC website that can help you. And as I go through these tools, and after, Ruthann, if you can just scan the questions, and if there's some pertinent questions that have come up so far, I'd be more than happy to take them.
Will do. So go through the tools, and if people have questions, I'll be watching for those.
Wonderful. So first and foremost, BDC's website's a great wealth of information, kind of free complimentary information that you can have access to. So if you go to www.bdc.ca, on the top right-hand corner of the screen, there's a button that says Articles and Tools, and there's considerable amount of content there for Canadian businesses to leverage, including a number of thought leadership articles, as well as a number of templates that you can download, take away, and use in your business. And so there's some templates here that I've shared on the screen that you may find useful. So tools to look at your external environment, tools to look at just the internal performance of your organization. There's templates that you can use for business planning. There's templates that you can use for strategic planning. And I would really welcome you to take advantage of the resources that are there.
Jabir, are these in French as well?
They're in French as well. Yeah. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is just how distribution channels have changed as we've gone through COVID. So we've talked about customer segments, and we've talked about value propositions. One of the things that links the two together is how you go to market and what your distribution channels look like. So the questions to ask around the leadership table and the conversations to have are those around how have distribution channels been impacted by the crisis? What are we seeing in real time with our channel partners? The other thing to be really mindful of is how the crisis has impacted customers' purchasing behavior. And it doesn't matter if you're selling directly to the consumer market and selling, to ordinary Canadians, or if you're selling business to business. The customer buying journey and the customer purchasing behavior has evolved. So it's really being mindful of what that looks like in your industry. And then lastly, it's to ask the question, how do you develop a sales strategy to complement your current distribution channels? And one of the things that we're really seeing beneficial for clients and for companies that are doing so is embracing the online and digital channels. There's a number of studies that BDC has been involved in recently where we've looked at the number of SMEs that were actually selling online before the pandemic, and how many have started as a result of the pandemic, and how many are likely to continue. And what we've seen is a significant increase in the number of companies engaging online with their customers, with their clients, and with other businesses. So I'll talk really briefly about the impacts if you're a B2C business and what we're seeing in the marketplace, and I'll also talk about the impacts if you're a B2B business. So one of the things for B2C businesses is that we know that footfall in retail has dropped significantly. Not as many people are going to storefronts. They're not going to shopping malls. They're not visiting in person as often or as frequently as they were beforehand. They are going to digital channels to either complete the transaction and buy their products and services, or at least to research so much more, so when they do go into a physical location to buy something, that they're spending less time there. So the types of considerations that Canadian businesses who are selling directly to consumers should be taking is, what does that online channel look like for them, and how does it complement their traditional network? they need to evaluate the role and the number of stores that they have, and they also need to look at what other uses their storefronts could have, and many see them as potential warehouses. The anecdote that I'll add to this is a few years ago when we saw Amazon's acquisition of Whole Foods, a number of analysts were talking about how smart that move was, as Amazon was looking to move towards Amazon Fresh, and how they could use the network of Whole Food stores as almost mini distribution centers for the delivery of fresh produce. And in a similar vein, it's looking at your storefronts, whether it be one or whether they be multiple, and saying what alternative uses do they have? Can they be used as distribution networks? Those companies that have adopted this click and collect or this curbside delivery model are in effect using their stores as pseudo warehouses that their clients can use. So when we talk about going direct to market, there's two routes that you can go direct to market on the online space, and they both have their advantages and disadvantages. You can either go direct online, and what I mean by this is have your own direct sales channel, which you're transacting through your website. The pros of this approach are that you have complete control of your brand and your customer experience. The disadvantages are, though, it requires a higher level of investment and it needs a certain level of IT expertise, either in-house or with a strategic partner that you'll work with to deploy this. The other alternative or the other option that Canadian businesses have is to go through indirect channels. So leveraging channels such as Amazon or other online marketplaces to be able to distribute their products. And the pros of this approach really is that firstly, traffic is higher. It's like the difference between having your storefront on a regular neighborhood street and having your storefront inside a shopping mall. So you have higher traffic, but that higher traffic doesn't come at a significant investment up front. On the con side, the investment that needs to be made is that you end up paying a higher commission to those marketplaces. And within those marketplaces, you also have much more competition, and you may not necessarily have control over the positioning of your product and your total brand experience. So it's important for Canadian businesses as they're looking to go online to weigh the pros and cons of this particular of these two approaches. The next thing that I want to talk about is what about the B2B marketplace? What impacts does this digitization of sales or business development have? You may not be in a world where you're directly selling online, where your clients prefer to go and buy online. But that world where more of the buying journey is happening over a digital medium is becoming more and more the norm. So it may not be online sales, but there's an element of digital and online business development. For many industries, including the healthcare industry, where I was a part of for such a long time, I did most of my buying at trade shows, in face-to-face meetings. Those forums aren't happening the way that they were beforehand. And in fact, as we move into the future, yes, trade shows will return, but there's going to be more digital options for Canadian businesses. So it's going to be asking the question, what digital channels can we leverage? How can we embrace digital business development to either drive more traffic towards our website, as we would have tried to drive traffic towards a booth at a trade show? Or what types of things can we do to engage more prospects? Or what types of things can we do to improve the buying journey for our existing customers, and how can we do this using digital channels? The other thing to take into consideration are some of the points that are on this this slide, which is really looking at how you can work in partnership with partners who are in your value chain for your kind of end user, and how you can use digital channels to be able to create a win-win-win situation, a win for yourself, a win for your partner, and a win ultimately for the end customer. And what we've seen with a number of businesses that we work with is that what they've been doing is they've been tying together different parts of the value chain with technology. So using the same digital platform for different members of the value chain to be able to work with work together much more collaboratively and much more seamlessly, that are driving cost efficiencies for them, but at the same time delivering more value and more a higher quality of service for their end clients. The last thing I really want to touch on before we wrap this up is really the impact on supply chain and operations. So supply chain, as well as how businesses operate on a day-to-day basis, and having these considerations around your leadership table. Firstly, in years past, the buzzword really has been around just-in-time inventory and supply chain efficiency. And that worked really well in the last 10, 15 years. And a lot of companies adopted those models and really made their supply chains cost effective, increased their margin, were able to pass that off to their clients and their customers at for the same product and service offering at a cheaper price point. But the conversations that we're having now are really around supply chain resiliency. What happened in January, February, as a lot of kind of Asian manufacturing facilities were having to shift their production away from what they were typically producing towards more health-related products to tackle the pandemic in the Far East, led to significant challenges for a number of businesses here in Canada. And so Canadian companies have been having this conversation around how can we diversify our sources of supply, how can we onboard kind of local vendors and local partners in our supply chain to make sure that we're able to mitigate the risks in our supply chain and make sure that we don't have that same type of impact that we had before. An example that I'll give is I know of two companies in Western Canada that were in the consumer packaged goods space, and they were producing a very similar product in a growth market, and they were both taking it to market very, very successfully. One had partnered with a particular manufacturer that met their quality standards, and that they had really worked together to build a strong relationship and really kind of drive that perfect product. The other organization explored 3, 4, 5 different manufacturing partners and decided to work with 3 or 4 of them. And their reasoning and their logic at that particular point in time was really to make sure that they had a local manufacturer that was close to where they felt their core demand was going to come from, so they could get their product to those customers a little bit quicker. What happened with both of those companies is they had really hockey stick growth. But with the company that was working with that one vendor, they hit kind of a ceiling where they maximized the production capacity of that one vendor. Where the other company that was working with 3 or 4 different manufacturers was able to push through that ceiling because their partners had more manufacturing capabilities, and they as an organization had a much more resilient supply chain. So whilst both companies did very, very well, one company was able to capture much more opportunity. So it's going to be asking the same types of conversations within your supply chain. The other thing to take into consideration is that the question around should key functions or important parts of that supply chain that are so important, should they be brought back internally so you can control the risk? And what does the integration of new suppliers look like in your business? And then the last piece that I really want to touch on around operations is, what does that mean for you as leaders and how you lead your teams, especially teams that are invariably more virtual. So the things that I would highlight is that, additional effort needs to be taken to make sure that the team aligns with the new strategy. There's a lot of change in the world around us. So how can we make sure that we're aligning our teams with the direction that our organizations are going in? The other part to the question is just this focus on objectives and results. The days of clocking in at 9 and clocking out at 5 are moving away. It's not a time environment anymore, especially as more people are working from home. Or really, the way to look at it is more people are really working where they live. And so it's just this understanding and this appreciation that everyone will have different circumstances, but all of your employees will have, the best interest of the organization at heart, and that leadership will need to evolve to focusing on objectives and results rather than, the particular hours put in for particular roles and for particular tasks. Having regular touch points with your team when you're not seeing each other, where water cooler chats aren't as possible. It's just making sure that those lines of communication are open and they're built into your strategy as an organization. And then the last part of it is just evaluating your leadership style to make sure that you're able to tailor your leadership style to what is going to move the needle for your teams that you're working with. And lastly, in the operational space, and I'll really direct you towards BDC's website for a lot more information on this, but it's, how do your business practices change given the adaptations that you need to make to your physical work environments. So as you go through, have these three conversations, you'll have a number of priorities that you're going to have as kind of action items or strategic imperatives that you want to follow forward or follow through with as an organization. You won't be able to do all of them at once. And so what we would highly recommend is that you prioritize them on the ones that are going to kind of deliver the maximum impact with the minimal amount of effort. So really identifying the quick wins that are going to move the needle for your organization. And as consultants love 2x2s and little charts, this is an example of something that can be used to really communicate what you're doing and why you're doing it with your teams. And lastly, as you identify those strategic imperatives, make sure that you assign accountability to members on your team. So everyone knows who's doing what, by when it's expected to get done, and who's going to be accountable for those particular activities on the leadership table. And then to meet regularly as a team and evaluate whether you've achieved those objectives or if you haven't. And if you haven't, it's not about holding the person who's accountable, it's not about holding their feet to the fire. It's really about, as a leadership team, having that conversation around what roadblocks can we remove to make sure that we're setting our teams up for success and that we can actually meet this objective by the time we next get together. And make sure that we keep these documents, that we keep these strategies as living, breathing documents. So just to wrap up on the three things that we've just talked about: pertinent conversations around the leadership table on just seizing new opportunities and offering the right products and services to your team, adapting to new distribution channels, and lastly, continuing as an organization to meet the needs of your teams and remain attractive employers as you go through the pandemic. BDC has been at the heart of a lot of the support that Canadian businesses have received through COVID. We're incredibly proud to have been able to play the role that we have, and that Canadian businesses have been needed to. We continue to be here for Canadian businesses. So I would definitely direct you towards BDC's Information Hub for entrepreneurs. In that hub, you'll find information about what's happening in the economy, what's happening with SMEs. Also, you'll find information on what financing solutions are available for access to capital for Canadian businesses, as well as what programs BDC Advisory Solutions, what programs I'm leading, what programs my colleagues are leading, that are really designed to move the needle for Canadian businesses. And the other great resource to really have a look at is just the Government of Canada's COVID-19 Information Hub. And here, you'll see information on the spread of the pandemic and the impact of the pandemic, and you may be able to get some leading insight into what the next steps from the government is going to be in response to the pandemic. There's also access to additional resources for businesses. So BDC isn't the sole source of information. There's a number of great organizations in Canada who are doing some fantastic things to support Canadian businesses, and you'll be directed to those from the Government of Canada website. So Ruthann, I've kind of talked about everything I really wanted to talk about. I hope the members have found it insightful. Have there been any kind of questions or comments that have come up in the chat that I could answer?
I think I'm going to wait and just see what people have gone in there. But a couple of takeaways for me is that really doing some good diagnostics and updates on your customer segment was really, I mean, it is obvious, but I mean, what's changing, what's going forward, because we're going to be entering month 10 of this change. And honestly, people are talking about February, March. So we'll be looking at a year. So there's a lot that's changed in terms of customer behaviors, customer buying, and so forth. What are some of the recommendations or some tools for businesses just to dive into, you got to figure out what's going on before you embrace a tool to move forward. So what's the first step there?
I think the first step is really having an open kind of line of communication with your customers, and really taking a collaborative approach to the market. With the pandemic, one of the evolutions that we've seen is just this willingness to collaborate, and especially in kind of a vendor-customer relationship, that expectation of having it perfect from day one is not as strong as it used to be. There's more partnerships with organizations looking to work together to achieve the optimal outcome. So the one thing we would say is definitely have that open communication channel with your customers, speak with them on a regular basis, understand what's happening with them and what's changing in their businesses, and bring that feedback back to the leadership table. So everyone within the organization is really understanding what's changing in their clients and their customers' worlds.
Right, and to make it very intentional. And the same thing with the resiliency in your supply chain. You brought up a couple of key points there, and one is, when would it be appropriate to bring it back in-house?
Really, what organizations, the conversations they need to be having is one around risk management, and looking at how critical a particular component of the supply chain is to their business operations, and really evaluating the risk of having that part of your supply chain external to your organization. So where there is kind of unnecessary risk, where it's causing a lot of sleepless nights for the leadership of an organization, those are the parts of the supply chain that a real strong consideration needs to be taken of whether to bring those pieces in-house. And then that will open up a series of kind of subsequent conversations really around the business case behind it, and does it make business sense, and really looking at then having that larger business conversation. But it is, in a nutshell, the short answer is it's a risk management question.
Great. Julia's put in this, and I think that this is it. It's the old adage, how do you eat an elephant? When you're looking at strategy and people think, oh my gosh, this is a huge workload associated with strategic management. Where do people start with this, and how do you break it up? 1 minute or less.
Well, the one sentence answer is, how do you eat an elephant? And I'll say, in small bites. So that's one, but it is very true. It's the same thing with with strategy or building a strategic document. It's really looking at the template and attacking the little parts of the template, one by one. And so leadership teams can do this themselves, knowing that they don't have to complete this in a week or a weekend or a couple days, that they can look at the most important parts of a strategic plan and take it over a course of a month or 2 months, or they can engage kind of external facilitators to help facilitate the conversation with their leadership teams, people who do this time in and time out, over and over again. And these are the types of kind of supports or resources that BDC has and others have in the marketplace that really support Canadian businesses.
Excellent. Get off the carousel and get on the flywheel.
Exactly.
All right. I just want to thank you and remind all of the people that have logged in today that this has been recorded, and that the BDC website has a huge amount of resources and tools and expertise. And I was really stunned to hear that you have subject matter experts in almost every domain that people are looking for within business. So thank you again, Jabir, for joining us today. And to everyone on the line, let's make Canada better, one business at a time. Thank you.
Indeed, thank you very much.